What's up, you guys? Intempus here. I'm going to be sharing with you guys some tips and tricks using the Ableton Live equalizers. My goal with this video is to share with you guys some techniques that I've been using with the equalizers in Ableton Live to improve my workflow, and also share with you some tricks that might help you in mixing, mastering, or even sound design. So let's get right into it. So this first one is pretty straightforward. It's about giving yourself a really useful default preset to save you time in the long run. When I pull in the EQ8 onto this track here, you can see right off the bat, I have a low cut filter as number 1 and a high cut filter as number 4. And then 2 and 3 are just normal bell curves. The reason why I did this is because when I'm bringing in an EQ8, typically I'm either doing, I'm cutting off the low end, cutting off the high end, or, cutting or boosting using the bell curves. But when you have the standard setup that Ableton gives you with 4 bell curves, it's kind of overkill in a way. I mean, typically, at least for me, I like to have the option of having the 3 options instead of just the 1 option of the bell curve. It's been really useful instead of coming in here and constantly having to change what the cut is in the filter modes. Instead of doing that, you already have them here, and you can see that you're not really cutting anything out of the frequency range, of the audible frequency range, I should say. Well, number 1 is cutting anything lower than 30 hertz, which you're really not hearing. And number 4 is cutting anything above 22 kilohertz, which is, both of them are outside the human hearing range anyways. So it's pretty safe to make this as your default preset. The way you can make your default preset is pretty easy. Just set up the filter modes that you want. You can add more points if you'd like, but then go ahead and right click on the EQ8 here and save as default preset, and you'll have that preset come up every time you bring in an instance of the EQ8. So this second tip is another time saver. Basically, it's just knowing when to use the EQ3 over the EQ8. Usually I used to never use the EQ3, but I've been using it more often for very specific scenarios, but scenarios that I use almost all the time in my music production. So instead of clicking on the 1 and then setting the frequency here to do a low cut, bring in the EQ3 and just hit that button, and it's the same exact thing. So to give you an audible example, keep this timing in mind right here. So we'll go ahead and drop in the EQ8. Watch with the EQ3. And you're already done. It's a fraction of a second difference, but it makes a big difference in the long run. So we were to do a low cut and a high cut, right? So, and we have something like that. You can accomplish the same thing by just hitting these 2 buttons here on the EQ3. And let's do it with the EQ3. A click of a button and you accomplish the same thing here, and if you really wanted to, you can fine tune here the low cut and the high cut. But something to keep in mind, something to try out, and it's been saving me a little bit of time here and there, and it's just been helping a lot. So that's tip number 2. The third tip that I have is another time saver. It's knowing when to use the reset all gains function. So basically, when we're EQing, we might do something and realize that we're not really getting the effect that we were looking for. And so what do? Either we set all the points to match up and be fairly even again, or we just scratch that instance completely and bring in a new instance, start with a completely fresh patch. But what you can also do, and it might be a little more efficient to do as well, is when you have all these points and you're not liking it and you want to reset it, just go ahead and right click and hit reset all gains. But keep in mind also that it's resetting all the gains, and this gain knob right here is the one that it's resetting. So when you go to something like a low cut, you see that the gain, it's not really it doesn't utilize the gain function. It just doesn't work that way. So with low cuts, high cuts, the notch filter, just by definition of the filter, it doesn't utilize the gain function. So it works with the bell curves, but typically people work with bell curves the most. So that reset all gains function might really help out. Okay, so this next tip is basically to help you learn how to read the frequency display in a very easy way. So you can see the frequency display here, and when a sound is being played on this track here, you see the frequency range populate. There's a really easy way to read this frequency display. And you can see these lines here. These lines are representing intervals of frequency. So when we look here, you can see that this line right here is starting at 40 hertz, and it's going to go up by an increment of 10. So you have 40 hertz, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. And you can see that break on 100 right here. And then from there, it goes up in increments of 100. So we have 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, and 1K. So now we hit that 1K mark there, and then you can see that it splits, and now we're working with increments of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10,000 hertz there. So that's essentially how the frequency display is helping you to read what frequencies are hitting where. This is really helpful if you're working with a track and just visually you can see what frequencies are hitting where, and you can guesstimate really closely what the frequency is that you're looking for. So there's another thing that's actually just as helpful, if not more helpful. So if we bring in an EQ8, I just brought in this kick rack, and I'm just using this kick as an example. But if we look at this frequency display, you can also see on the bottom left-hand corner in this orange box here, you can see what frequency the cursor is currently on, as well as the dB range from 0 that you're on as well. And I guess I should mention as well that you can see on the left-hand side here, this grid is going in dB, and you can kind of get a rough idea as to how much boost you're doing. And if you want to be especially fine-tuned, you can see the amount of cutting or boosting that you're doing in that orange box as well as the Q on the bottom. When you're holding down one of these points, you can also see in the bottom left in that orange box that it's displaying the Q as well. One thing that really interested me and has been really helpful is in that box, you can also see what pitch or what note that frequency is translating to. So right here, we're at 204 hertz, and that's G sharp 2. That can be helpful for a variety of reasons, but it's especially helpful for me when tuning percussion instruments. So for example, the kick that we have, if we just go ahead and have a kick in one of these and we have it play, let's just go ahead and solo that for a second. Sorry about that. And you can kind of start seeing where that kick is hitting, and you kind of start guesstimating at what note that this kick is essentially tuned to. And from there, you can tune the kick to be exactly where you want it to be. This scale function is really cool. And before I do that, I want to show you guys this scale function. So what the scale function does is affect how much gain is on each of these points. So we'll go ahead and turn off the 1 and the 4 and just have these curves here. With the scale function here, it'll affect just how much gain is added or subtracted from both or all points that you have enabled in the EQ. So we just have those 2 points, and you can see that you can affect all the points with that scale function. This is kind of a trick, kind of a tip, but the EQ8 is really powerful. So what we're going to talk about this time is the mid-side mode that you can utilize in the EQ8, as well as the left-right mode. Typically, when you're doing EQing, you're working in the stereo mode, where the entire stereo channel is affected by the EQ in exactly the same way. But the really cool thing is that you can actually affect just the left channel or just the right channel, or use the mid-side technique to affect whatever information, whatever audio information is in the middle, and whatever audio information is on the sides independently from each other. So you can do that by going to this global mode here, and you can see that it says stereo. Click that and you can change it to either affect the entire stereo channel, the left or the right channel, or the mid side. That's what the MS stands for here. So the left right is pretty self-explanatory, but let's go into the mid side mode here. And this is typically called the mid side technique, where you can make things wider or narrower by using this technique. You can boost high frequencies on the sides in order to make things sound wider. You can maybe boost a little bit of the low end in the mid channel in order to have a little more bass in your tracks. It really just depends. So the mid side technique is used a lot in mastering, but it can be used in certain elements in mixing, and it can be used in sound design for very creative ways as well. So essentially how it works, I've just kind of made the frequency display a little bit bigger, and we're in the mid side mode now, and you can see we have this edit switch now, and this will essentially switch between the mids. That's what the M stands for. Click it, and now you're affecting the sides. That's what the S stands for. We'll also turn on the audition mode again so that we can just hear what's going on in the side channel. So now we're just affecting the sides. That's what we're hearing right now. And we can go to that edit mode. Now we're affecting the mids. Maybe we'll add, a little low mid-range type of thing to the mid channel. And so now you can hear that we're affecting the mid channel independently from the side channel, and it's really useful technique, and especially in mastering, you do have to be careful with it. But I mean, the fact that the EQ8 can do that it's phenomenal. So definitely something to try out if you're either sound designing, mixing, or the next time you're mastering, whatever you're doing, try that mid-side technique out. The next tip I have for you guys is another function of the EQ8, and I'm pretty sure this function is in other native Ableton plugins as well, but it's the oversampling function. And you can see that when you go right click on the EQ8 and you see oversampling right there. So if we click that, when it's check marked, that means it's on, it's working. And you might have noticed a very subtle difference in the EQ. The subtle difference was on 0.4 with that high cut, and you can see that curve changed just that little bit when we turn on the oversampling. So the oversampling's off, we turn it on, you see that subtle curve change. So what is actually happening? Essentially, I want to keep this very basic because this can get very technical, and there's a lot to know about this, but I highly encourage you guys to check out more info on it, but I'll just give you the basics. So essentially, Oversampling is dealing with the idea of the Nyquist theorem. What the Nyquist theorem is, very basically, it's for digital audio, and in order to accurately represent a frequency range, say from 0 to 20,000 hertz, which is the human hearing range, in order to accurately represent the frequency range, you need to sample that audio by a factor of 2. So you can see that the EQ is able to work all the way up to 22,000 kilohertz right here. We can see that right here. That's the range. So in order to accurately represent that, essentially, you would have to sample 22,000 kilohertz by a factor of 2, which means that would be about 44,000 kilohertz. So what does that mean? Basically, that means that the EQ8 can work with 0 to 22,000 kilohertz and accurately represent it and work with that. However, you'll notice something when working with the high end with certain filter modes. So right now we have the high cut enabled, but just watch what happens when we start going up the frequency range. You can see that high cut starts to get squashed, and at the very end you see it kind of bump right up against the end like that, and it's not a smooth transition like it is with the rest of the frequency range. You see it's very smooth, but once you start getting to the high end, it starts to get crushed a bit. And it's the same thing if we had a high shelf and we move up the frequency range. The high shelf gets squashed right at the end. You can see that squash right there. And it's the same thing with the bell curve as well. So when we start getting up there, it gets squashed. And that is gonna change the audio. It'll change the way the EQ is reacting. So let's go ahead and turn on the oversampling function. And you can see that slight difference again. Now notice what happens once we start moving up the frequency range. That bell curve now isn't getting squashed at the end. It's staying consistent all the way through the frequency range. So the oversampling is essentially allowing the EQ8 to process frequencies above 22,000 kilohertz, which allows the EQ to treat the high end that we can hear to be consistent. It depends on the filter mode. So we have the bell curve one there, and it'll be the exact same with the high shelf. You'll see that it doesn't get crushed at the very end of that anymore. It stays consistent. And the same exact thing with the high cut, stays consistent, as opposed to having the oversampling off and it getting crushed. Keep in mind that that is making a difference in your audio when you're EQing. You can change the way the filter mode is reacting by using the oversampling feature. When you're dealing with high end, it'll be a lot more consistent. So there you go. You know what? Let's go ahead and do an audio example with this as well. And I think what I'm going to do is use the audition mode or the solo mode here. So if we click that, now if we click on any of the points, we will just listen to what that frequency range that the point is dealing with. So we'll go ahead and play the track. I highly suggest some headphones, and we'll go ahead and try and hear what the high end reacts like without oversampling and with oversampling. So this is without oversampling. It's going to be very hard to hear. So maybe try and focus on that sweeping sound when you're hearing that EQ. Now, this is with oversampling. it's much more consistent. And you can hear that there's not so much of a sweeping type of EQ effect. It's just much more consistent. So highly encourage you guys to hear that a few times, and I hope you can hear the difference. If not, maybe I'll make another video where we can really get into this whole oversampling idea. There you go, guys. There's some tips and tricks using the Ableton Live equalizers. Leave a like on the video if you learned something. Thank you so much for checking out the video. Subscribe to the channel for more content. I'm doing more music projects and tutorials just like this one. Thank you guys so much. Once again, my name's Intempus. I'll see you guys later.